And we are here not live on Plus One EXP. If you are watching this later, you are not live here with us right now because this is our Made for the Void design workshop. This is one of 2 workshops I'm doing. This one is also in part for me to figure out how I want to do these workshops. So it's going to be the rougher of the 2. I also had the choice, finalize my notes or eat some sugary cereal, then take a 20-minute nap. And I made the sugary cereal 20-minute nap choice, which also turned into a 40-minute nap. And so even less so are my notes prepared for today. But it's a chance to sit down and just kind of walk through the Void, what it is, some of the design elements and choices that get made. We'll touch a lot on Together We Go games broadly, as well as some of the specifics through the Void that differentiate it from Down We Go and other games that are designed using the SRD, which should all be distinctive and different. We've got some folks on this call with us off to the side. Some of them are just going to be lurking. Some of them may have questions. If y'all have ideas, want to interrupt, if you have something specifically you're thinking about that you want to discuss, there will be plenty of time for that. I plan on having 45 minutes to an hour worth of talking to do. And so, but I left 2 hours on my schedule to be able to stop, pause, talk about what other people want to talk about, or work through things with other creators. And yeah, 2 documents that we, like I said, have pulled up are the SRD, the creators kit for Together We Go games, which you can find at TTRPG.link/TWG, which is the kind of core design notes. It's a living document for Together We Go games, which is the core framework that Through the Void uses. It's based on Down We Go. I was a system developer for it, but the original game was created by Marcus Linderum. And then the second thing I have pulled up is the beta ashcan for Through the Void, that we'll be walking through some and talking about a few of the elements for also too. The final version of Through the Void will go to crowdfunding early next year, late probably middle to late spring. But it's playable and ready to go right now, and we'd love to have people designing in the system, as well as we'll have contributors designing for it. So that's why we have this set of workshops set up, also just to kind of keep my own design accountability on track as well. So those are a couple different things. I want to start just kind of talking a little bit about Together We Go, how the system evolved, other pieces like that. For people who aren't familiar, it started with a 1-page rule set for a game called Down We Go that Marcus Linderum came on and played with us after I had seen it in a minimalist RPG group. I was like, this is really great. Come play it. We played it. It was a blast. And we got Cameron joining us. I played it. It was an absolute blast to play through, to explore with Marcus. And I was like, hey, if you put together some city rules, we could make a fun little like 20-page, 12-page zine out of this. Ended up being a 76-page long book that's got a hardbound and softbound option for it. I'm really excited about it. We've got proofs coming in from the printer sometime this week or next for that game. But we're going to look at a little bit of what pulled that into focus. For me, a lot of what made that process great was going through the full development process with Marcus and realizing a big part of where the final version of this game came from is the different voices that went into it. There actually originally was no sense of, like, especially with a minimalist design aesthetic, which most Together We Go games have, there was no sense of what is the voice of this game. Some of the earliest contributors were Marcus, myself, and then Aaron King, who also helped design all of the factions for the game. And when Aaron designed the factions, in a lot of ways, that set the tone more than anything else for what the world the game was taking place in was going to be like. So in a lot of ways, the tone of Down We Go grew out of somebody else entirely. And so some of my reflections in the creators kit really are about, that's kind of my favorite thing about the game is it is the core system is simple enough and elegant enough and hearty enough that you can add in other voices to the process really easily. And there are times we edited for tone on a few things, but Sam, who's on the call with us, Sam's events, when they came in, there was like one piece of tone editing we did, and we even kept the original text in there, just kind of crossed out. Like it never got uncrossed. The gentrification beast is just the alternate name for that event. But like there are very few tonal shifts we found we really needed to make. I think one time somebody else threw in a very modern piece of technology that was a weapon, and so we edited that to like a repeating crossbow or something like that. Like there have been very few edits that we made as part of that process, just because it was a very broad tone that let people kind of speak into it very easily, and that is something that for Through the Void. So for me, immediately when I sat down to start designing it, I designed the core rules, I laid them out. And then I kicked the ship rules over to Emmy Vert and asked Emmy to take a stab at doing the ship rules, got them back. We play tested them, made some adjustments. I designed some kind of expanded pieces for them. I asked Aaron to design a couple factions along with a few other people to get that immediate input of not just my own design voice in that. And that's my approach to Together We Go games. Other people, Keegan, who's hacked Together We Go, like did all of the writing on the core thing for their games. But for me, one of the easiest ways to get the tension and the flexibility that I like in the tone of the writing is to start tossing things out to people right away. Because for me, that's one of the most exciting parts, is the collaborative nature of these very minimalist games. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also part of why the design workshops were really important for me also too, to just say, how can we equip and empower more people to be designing in the system? Before we launch into some of the specific mechanics, like there are four kind of key elements for Together We Go games that have been, I think, pushed to their limits in a lot of ways in Through the Void that we kind of created as we were creating the SRD, and that's one-page procedures. So if a procedure or a set of rules or how you do something takes up more than an A4 or A5 page to explain, you should ask yourself if it's too complicated, because it very well may be at that point in time. You should ask yourself if you should simplify it, but the more simplicity you have in what you wrote, actually the hardier things tend to be, because there tend to be less complex pieces that can start breaking down. And most of the editing that we did from other people, if we had to do editing, was actually about simplifying the rules, the procedures that they gave us back to kind of fit in. There was actually more tone elements that went into there was more tonal matching for procedures than there were for almost any other element in the game. All the mechanics are player facing. So Together We Go games, the ref is largely responsible for they don't ever make any rolls. They might make a D6 roll every once in a while for luck or something behind the scenes. But all of their rolls typically can be made before the game. And during the game, the actual roles and mechanics themselves are our player facing. So that lets the keeper, the GM, focus more on collaborative world building, building the communal narrative, inviting other people, and it equalizes. It takes a lot of the prep out and a lot of the other types of load off the GM to say that you're the type of player who shows up and manages things. You're not the type of player who has to have a ton of things that you do to prep in advance. And then anchored anti-canon. This is going to see a lot more in Through the Void. Like this was a design anchor for Down We Go, but in Through the Void, we actually created a set of procedures. Ty, Eldritch Mouse, came through and created a set of procedures to help talk about how, when you're doing anti-canon storytelling, how do you do that well, and what's a process for that? It is something that a lot of GMs won't need, but having that procedure lets us take GMs who have never used that style of play before and introduce them to that. But it's basically there's no core setting in Through the Void. There's no hey, here's how it is. There's a central location that things happen around, but there's not a canon. There's not a set of things that can or cannot happen within the game. The intent is that we create a lot of anchors that let the GM choose what does the canon of our world look like with the players, right? So we've had some people show up and run Through the Void in a very Star Wars style fashion with a bunch of funky little dudes, force powers, and other things like that throughout the course of the game. And that's a totally valid way to run and play the game. We've had other people show up and run it far more gritty, down to earth, like Battlestar Galactica, Marines on spaceships fighting aliens in space type vibe to it. We've had other people who have run it in far more of a I'd say Star Trek, and that is accurate as long as we're like maybe embracing a little bit more of the camp of the original series, or even Galaxy Quest to that end. But a lot of that's determined by the way that people are going to choose to anchor the anti-canon, which might be events they pick, abilities that come up, the way that people describe their characters or the type of ship that they're on. And some people play with just all that stuff dumped into a tumbler and kind of play as they want to go. But the setting itself also shifts around and moves and changes as you go. So just because you've been somewhere once does not mean it will be the same the next time you go there, nor should you necessarily expect that it's going to be. So anchored anti-canon is another huge design element. And then narrative crawling. This is another element that we're pushing out significantly further and through the void than it existed within Down We Go. But they're basically take a lot of the traditional activities of old school games, but we're layering a lot of narrative tech on top of them and focusing very heavily on emergent narrative. We're not going to ask questions like, can I hit that button with my knife from 30 feet away, right? Like that's not there's no rules for how far you can throw a knife. For one thing, especially with a game where science may play a higher role, like in Through the Void, I don't want anybody to feel like they have to be an expert, like technobabble your way through it, or the GM just decides, can that player hit the knife? If they're unsure, then they could have them make a luck roll to see if it's going to happen or not. But more often than not, there should just be a narrative decision that's made. Yes, it makes sense given your background that you can hit that button with a knife from 30 feet away, so you do, right? That should more oftentimes be the case. A couple of things you may hear me default language-wise to use during this time. OSR stands for Old School Renaissance. DWG stands for Down We Go. TTV stands for Through the Void. DDTV stands for DungeonDelvers.tv, the first hack that came out of the system. What is an OSR? Keegan wants to fight. And TWG, Together We Go, are all things you may hear me say as we go. But what is a role-playing game? Everyone wants to fight, apparently. Apparently everyone wants to fight today. Everyone woke up and chose violence on this call. A role-playing game is a game that is largely mediated by playing a role in the same way that a board game is the game that's largely mediated by playing on a board. Through the Void does not have a what is an RPG section. We can talk about that a little bit actually if we want to in just a second. Let's hit mechanics. First, you'll see very familiar mechanics in Through the Void to other games. You could knock it all out in a single A5. You'll see very familiar roles for old school systems, which are primarily D20 and D6 rolls. D20 is D20 plus specialty, which is like a fusion of stats, class, and abilities in Through the Void. There are 4 of them in most Together We Go games. There's 4 of them in Through the Void, but building alternate classes that map to one of those instead is very much a possibility. We'd love to see alternate classes get made or alternate specialties get made for the game. But it's basically going to be D20 plus your level and whatever your specialty is if it applies, if you have a specialty that applies. Combat, there's an initiative process. It's 1d6. You roll high, you go first. You roll low. The GM's has all the bad guys go first. There's an advancement process in Through the Void that's a little bit different than it is in Down We Go or the core system, but basically after a certain number of missions, you do level up and advance new things. And then we have the optional rule that if we have 2 optional rules, one about rolling crits and another one about if you roll your dice and it lands on the floor, then you get sucked into the void. You get sucked in, stop tweeting at me, Keegan. You get sucked into the void at the next reasonable moment, which is a little bit different because it just means at some point you'll be walking around and the keeper will decide you're close enough to whatever to get sucked out into the void, and it'll just happen. So it creates far more tension than just your character dying a grisly death. But after that point, a lot of the things we're going to look at for Through the Void specifically start to depart, because we built a lot more narrative tech for the GM into the system, and so that's kind of the core how TTV works. Keegan is still tweeting at me, and I should just ignore it, but apparently I can't. We're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the system kind of as we're going through. But again, if you have questions, if you need things, hop in, ask questions. You don't have to tweet at me to get my attention. Let's go ahead and put this up. We'll put this up next to us real quick. I don't know if this is helpful at all. It's probably certainly too small for most people to read, but it'll, I think, provide a little bit of visual aid for people who are watching. Shoot some DMs in Discord. That's right. Shot some DMs in Discord maybe. So this is Through the Void's character sheet. This has everything you need to know, all the different elements of your character. For the ash can, we moved the core rules onto the next page just to give a little bit more space to some different things we were trying to do. I don't know if it'll live in this thing. We may move the core rules back on, but we still kept the core rules all on one spread. It just gave us a little bit more space on the sheet and let us give a little bit more breathability to the size of the font. For things, but we've got your name XP, which is again a new thing you track now and Through the Void, because there is an XP system. You start with 2 points in any character. There's recon, which is very much stealth, things like sabotage, agility, deception, other things like that would go underneath recon. We also made a concerted effort for Through the Void to add, like, what is the social aspect of being a recon character. So like you'll see, in addition to maybe a physical or mental aspect, a social aspect for all of them generally, even though medic still holds a lot of social strength for bedside manner. Tech, which is willpower, logic, and system operations. Medic, which is poise, soothing other people or soothing wounds, and social influence generally. And then Merc is endurance, nerve, or your to hit bonus. Recon does your defense bonus. All of the abilities are just very simply laid out. In my experience, like, there are a couple times where I'll write a longer ability and just kind of work out how can I make it shorter and shorter to get it to the right length. You do end up with some weird gobbledygook rules every once in a while when you do that, like slip, which is one of my favorite moves by the medic. The medic in Through the Void has a couple of different kind of drug-based abilities that they can give people. One which just increase their strength, or slip, which basically speeds up your perception of time. So you have 2 times the amount of moves or actions you would normally have for the level of minutes that the medic has. So the target also takes 1 damage when you use slip on them. So there is a physical toll for using it, which is not something we've ever done. But the way it's written, though clear, it's only clear if you know the lingo of Through the Void, which will say is the one downside to some of the abilities right now, and it's something that I try to pay attention to. But usually it's a matter of testing it and seeing if people ask me questions about that rule before they take it, or if they just do. The levels that you have determine what your hit points are. Your highest level, or if you're tied, determines where it starts. Advancement will move it up once every single time you advance. You get 1 extra hit point. And then a new element we introduced in Through the Void was backgrounds. Backgrounds are one of my favorite things. They've seen a lot of action in a lot of the hacks of the system that have come out also too. They basically give you some additional, I was about to say background again. They give you some additional role play elements to kind of grab onto for your character. So the 4 that we've started off with for Through the Void that are on the core character sheet, though, I will say on the final character sheet, you won't have 4 options to choose from. You'll have a space where you write your background in, because the goal is to have 16 to 20 backgrounds that are available that you can take, so that people have a sense of all the different types of jobs you might have, and you can be a little bit more precise. But these are also all pulled from a lot of, like, just my favorite sci-fi properties. So like Legion Officer is 100% a riff on kind of Starfleet, and other elements like that. So I've seen this before. Lets you gain critical knowledge once per session. Andromorph, I've got a mod for that. You can use an implant to be able to roll twice, basically with advantage on something if you've got a certain part of your body that's built for that. I also let people use it as a save if they fail sometimes to be able to roll again. Verdant Mystic, which really are an homage to Vulcans, but also more so to Alan Cummings' character in Galaxy Quest. Is I sense something, so being able to detect thoughts or danger in advance, or classic bounty hunter, because as much as I think Star Wars is fantasy, a lot of people think of it as sci-fi, and everybody loves a bounty hunter. Also, I just love it when some weird bounty hunter shows up and is looking for someone all of a sudden, so I want it to be a big part of the thing. We went a little bit more specific with the loadout for Through the Void, kind of saying like, hey, you've got a certain number of slots in which you can carry thing, but also here's like heads, other stuff like that. And really, by and large, equipment is just narrative permission. It's not like, we shouldn't think about equipment as like, hey, here's the stats that go with this item. Though some types of items may give you bonuses to hit or to damage or to certain types of rolls, and that's easy stuff to lay out. Largely, most of the starting equipment just gives you the ability. Like if you have a heads-up display, then you have the benefits of having information in front of your space as you move around. If you've got if you've got a med kit, the med kits do tell you specifically, hey, you can heal three hits. You can 3 times. You can fix 1 health on somebody, right? So they do sometimes tell you what they do, but most of the time they're just like, hey, do you have this or not? Mag boots, you can activate them and they keep you from getting whipped around in zero gravity or pulled off when all of a sudden somebody like starts to depressurize a section. So very, very rarely in this starting equipment is there any sort of specific mechanics, but there will be more robust rules in the final version for that. I also just think it's nice to have a place where you can write down other people's names, so your crew roster is included in this. We've got ship rules. I want to go a little bit faster through these so we can get through some of the crunchier parts, or some of the less crunchy parts of this, because I think it's easy to just go through and read any of these later. But your ship rules, basically ships have different sizes. Those are slip, coaster, runner, long, row, heavy, and cruiser. Those all correspond to different sizes of dice conveniently. Also mechanically, it's important. And for every single, so a slip has 2 slots in it for modules. Modules tell you specifically what your ship can do beyond the normal stuff of fly through space, move around, and have some sort of very basic form of weaponry. If you want to upgrade any of those things or be able to do additional things, you're going to attach a module. Modules are these pieces down at the bottom, right, that let you do different things. They're broken out in kind of a similar way to classes, but they don't give any sort of class bonuses, and you can pick as many as you have slots in your ship. We do anticipate this being a big part of Through the Void that is distinctive, like trying to get modules, trying to upgrade your ship, trying to make things nicer, build things out. You'll see a lot of notes like at the bottom here, the void is scattered with other modules and schematics. If you want them, go find them. This is our way of just head nodding to players and GMs. Like, if you don't see what you want on this list, just write it down. Like you should be like, this should be the starting point at the table. You should be creating things as you go. For your characters and for your ships. But basically, this setup also lets us very quickly say, if you wanted to do like very tactical hex-based combat, you could toss down dice of different colors on a hex map and have those represent your ships and other people's ships that you're in combat with. So by just having the dice size, we create that ability and let you be able to kind of create that very tactical miniatures feel if you want to dive into that. Just making sure, checking to see if we had any messages come in or if people are just objectively harassing me. And so... No, Keegan didn't send me any sort of messages in Discord yet, so we're all good. But yeah, so and again, a lot of the equipment for ships are based off some of my favorite ships throughout different sci-fi properties. Like the wormhole generator is 100% a Farscape reference. A lot of the things you'll see in here, if you're like, that sounds really cool, invariably I probably stole it from somewhere or something. There I was like, I love this show, I want this. My hands down favorite module that never sees play is just a docking port, like having smaller ships inside of bigger ships. It's one of my favorite things. No one ever does it. You should do it. It's a lot of fun. Again, we see the rules for flying ships are all again one single page. Very easy kind of take in and digest. But this gets us kind of through some of the core pieces and into the kind of narrative elements, which is where a lot of the design starts to take off. So we've got the three kind of we've got a basic play loop structure for Through the Void that really a lot of times, if you're like, I want to design adventures, right? Or I want to create something specific. A lot of these elements that are in the loop are things you're going to look at actually designing. And an adventure itself, the best way to think about an adventure in the system is that you're designing a specific loop you want players to navigate when they come in. But the core loop is that you'll kind of start at Eternus Station, you'll get a job, you'll go out into the void. When you kick back from Eternus, you'll do something called an unseen, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. But these are basically interstitial scenes that are happening somewhere else to other people, not your characters, and the likelihood that your characters will ever interact directly with an unseen. They might very well deal with the fallout of an unseen, but they will probably never insert themselves into the characters that they see or are talking about in an unseen. If they do, it'll be at a later time, at a later place, when maybe things have come home to roost as far as fallout from one of those goes. Traveling the Void, I simply have people make a D6 roll based on who's piloting every single day to see if anything interesting happens on ship, but I'll kind of do the interstitials as they're headed out into the void. So tell me what your character is doing on the ship, how you're getting ready for this job, what we see. All right, cool. Now tell me about your section of the unseen. And once they've done that, once we've had them make any rolls for prep they need to make, do any research they want, sharpen weapons, clean, fix something that's gone wrong on the ship, all those different pieces, we will then have them just kind of narrate their section of the unseen. But Traveling the Void I treat very lightly when I'm not doing kind of campaign play or focused on a hex crawl adventure where traveling through the void is a significant part of what they're doing. Like if ship-based movement, which I know, like we've got Christian, who's lurking in the background, is working on a flying around hex crawl in space. Then you're just going to see Traveling the Void be the primary thing that you're doing. Where you're going to in that process, it may not be a drift precisely, but drifts are the places that you go, and when you hit a drift, you're going to start doing something called lore building right beforehand. This is the same as loot and lore, and down we go. I just liked lore building a little bit better, but you're going to ask players questions as you go in. You'll do the drift. The drift tends to be far more tactical, far more kind of classic role playing, if you want to. Though we've had a number of sessions where the players really aren't asking a lot of tactical questions. They just really want to focus on the story beats. And that's fine also too. They don't ask like, how many feet wide is this room? Like, how long is the corridor? They don't engage in those tactical elements, and that's fine. Like, just like with any sort of dungeon or system, you're going to have certain people who get really into the nitty gritty of it, certain people who don't. And then you travel back through the void, do a docking action, and return to Eternus. So it's basically this out with this kind of side story that you're using to build the world a little bit that you're playing around in, lore building that you use to look at the specific part of the world you're about to go into. You go to the drift, you do the job, the task, the thing that you're there for, and then you travel back through the void, check for XP, and go and do station play for a little while, which can be as short or as long as you want. That's the basic loop of it. But again, you could have multiple drifts on a loop, right? You could have like, hey, we did an unseen on the way out, but really we know we've got this 3-part job that we've got. We know we need to go to this location for one thing, this location for another thing. in this location for a third thing. And so you wouldn't get all of those done in a single session, most likely. So you would then you could draw your loop out very differently, and you might have multiple unseens that you do within that. You would need to want to decide where the docking action happens and other stuff like that. You would want to note where you're going to do lore building, but essentially you can create a completely different loop. And if you're designing an adventure that is an ongoing adventure that has a lot of different elements to it, you would kind of want to chart it out like a loop. What are the different questions we want to be asking? Where are the different narrative beats we want to hit? Where do we want to get really granular, and where do we want to come back? If you're just staying on the ship the entire time, you might look at events instead of as a design element instead of drift, like things that are going to happen while you're in space that you know people are going to have to deal with. So all these are rules for how to do that. But we mentioned lore building a little bit. That's questions you ask that you're going to interject as you're about to get to drifts. You've got Speak the Stars, which is also known as Paint the Scene in a lot of places, which is basically letting players fill in details around things. It's a really strong tool that gets you as the GM used to querying players about what's happening around them and letting them know that the input they have is going to impact the world. But basically, anytime you don't know how to telegraph something well to a character, you can just ask them, how does your character know this? And let them tell you what's happening in the world for that minute. The Unseen is one of the biggest changes. It's a piece of tech by Jason Cordova. They're currently called Meanwhile Across the Station, but we will see different types of unseens that come out with the final version of the book. Some of them will be station-based. Some of them will be void-based, basically things that happen on different ships that are not your ship, or things that happen on, asteroid farms as you're cruising by them, or and then we'll have some that are specifically designed for if you're on a planet or planet-based location. What do you do then? So we'll have sets of unseens that are set up for different types or modes of play, because we don't always want to have people be like, oh, I have to look back at the station, right? If you're not going back to the station this session, look at something that's happening on an asteroid that you're about to fly by, right, in the very far distance, and learn a little bit about the lives of the people there. But it's basically a place that the drifters, or a story that the drifters typically won't touch except for during the docking action. But it's basically zooming in, like out, through a portal window across the station, and looking at kind of the B story that's happening. But the players determine and drive most of it. The docking action, which you've heard me mention a number of times, is when we look at two things: how the side story resolved. Which in the original Unseen, wasn't really a thing. You just kind of each narrated your elements. Sometimes there was a conclusion, sometimes there wasn't. But there was no here's what happened because of that. For me, I loved the B plots of Jake and Nog selling self-sealing stem bolts and working their way up to being very important property holders on Bajor in Deep Space Nine. It ends up tying into the main plot, but nobody else knows what's happening the entire time. Them kind of trying to just make a little bit of money so they can buy candy basically ends up being this whole weird, complicated B plot that you just see in these side scenes. And it's one of my favorite things that you'll see from time to time in different sci-fi properties. A lot of times they're even what we think of as filler episodes, or even what Lower Decks has done, right, as a Star Trek property, of being about the people who work behind the scenes in a starship. It's not about the main characters, right? But it's some of the richest parts of world building that you'll see, and some of the strongest comments we've gotten about it have come out of the Unseen specifically. But the docking action is a resolution point to that. We'll take a look at one in just a second. We'll talk about events and other things, how they're built. These are what drifts look like, right? They're 2 pages. They've got a pretty specific format. We can dive into them specifically. But while we're talking about Unseens, let's look at this. So the GM would read the Temple of Ba'arlik, right? A throng of anxious bodies press close to each other in the cool and dimly lit space. They are meeting to worship an ancient god from a long dead world. The first person would respond to this prompt. The second person would respond to the next prompt, third and fourth. So if you have more players, there's always going to be kind of one of these typically that lets everybody respond, like so that even if you're only picking 2 or 3, if you have more players than the 4 that are listed, I would say, pick, just ask for volunteers, or say, does somebody have an idea? Open it up to the table a little bit more. But lots of times I'm playing with 3 or 4 players. But the first one is: the room is quiet other than the shuffle of bodies and hushed breathing. What adorns the worshipers gathered here? So it could be tattoos, it could be clothes, it could be costuming that they put on. They might all wear masks. I don't know what it is, right? But people are going to kind of speak into existence. One person is going to say, hey, here's what we see the worshipers wearing that mark them as members of this temple, right? A song gathers the voices of the believers as one. What does it sound like, and what does it recall? So this is a chance for somebody to make up a past event that was important to this religion, along with some of the tonal realities of the songs of their worship. A parable is told by the hooded ancient form of speaker Baresh. What is it about? What tenets of Ba'ar does it evoke? And so, again, they're going to be building this religion as they go through this process. An offering is made to Ba'ar. Describe the ritual. What supplication does this congregation seek? What are they put this offering forward for? What is it like, right? So that we would go through that process. And again, interstitially, we'd be asking a couple players to tell us what it is that they're doing as they're traveling out into the void. So we're looking at the main plot on the way out, and then we're flashing over and we're doing a little bit of world building in the B plot. But it's all driven by the players, and it's letting them know that while they're out in the void, the station is big and alive and changing, and things are happening there. When you go back, whatever this temple has done will have been enacted in reality, right? And I've had players who have decided that they are now congregants at one of the temples of Ba'ar, like it becomes their god in play. It's a very cool thing to happen. Other ones will figure out rival temples or be atheist, or all the different things that come up in this. But it's been very interesting to watch the way that people even grab on to some of these, right? So you've got, and then the docking action is speak the stars. So this is one that everybody comes into. As we dock, the worshipers have departed, but there can be no waste on Eternus, which is a common refrain that goes through a lot of these, like the fact that things have to be taken care of. There can be no waste in Eternus, even space. How is the space of the temple used now, and what signs of worship linger here? So we would go around, and everybody would kick in a different way they see the space being used throughout the course of the rest of the week or the month or the intervals between worship. But what signs of worship still linger here? And this comes from working at churches for a long time also, I'll be honest, and having to share space. This is me processing through that, but knowing in a place where space would be a priority, what would it look like to set up your worship space and then have it be a market the rest of the week, or it's a restaurant, or something else is happening here? But in an environment where nothing can be wasted, what does it look like to use this space during the rest of the time? But they all get to speak into that one. It's fun. But we also have an attempt in addition to that, we've got dinner at CGI Fridays, which is about three very different couples going on dates at very different points in their relationship to a place called CGI Fridays. And then you follow one of them out and look at the rest of their night during the docking action. Water cycle tracks a drop of water as it goes from being ice outside to liquid inside, moves through the station, gets consumed, and then gets returned back out. What does that look like? The plasma purge is about just the mechanical workings and the strain that a scarcity mindset culture has to go through, stretching supplies as thin as possible, and something goes wrong, right? So smuggling stuff in, all different kinds of different pieces that make it into the end scenes, but there are all these B plots on the station. For me, it's one of my favorite additions, and it, like I said, we've gotten a ton of really positive feedback around it as well. And so there's also one about a rat going on adventures, or some kind of vermin that is also super fun. But if you have a line against harm to animals, skip that one. He doesn't make it through the end. All right, so that's Unscenes. Like I said, it's a new piece of tech. Eternus Station, though, this is a very brief here. I'm going to read some that Christian's studying. I've got spoiler warning. Sorry, Keegan. Well, maybe he'll survive in your Unseen. Maybe a player will just be like, I don't like that. let's do a different one, which is fine. Yeah, so there's a lot of potential leading into the the gameplay loop is laid out in the book, and breaking from it. Envisioning a scenario that requires 3 to 3 completed and back due to an in-universe time constraint or something like that. Yeah, I mean, again, thinking about here's the actual and part of it, like, you know, charting through the stars, like it's got a good feel to it, but like thinking about how we want characters and players to loop out, and kind of knowing like, hey, here's what you're going to do, or them knowing part of the loop but not all of it, because you as the GM know they might divert, or leaving that up to random chance of like you're going to get halfway through and you might have to decide to go do something else. It also pushes in things like, how much fuel management do you want to do? Like for most one shots, I'm like, you're going to go out and come back, don't worry about fuel, right? Some people will still buy fuel enhancing things for their ship while they're out there, but like that's just part of their flavor choice that they've decided on. But if you're going to go out on this really long trip, you're going to have to think about, how do we refuel, how do we resupply, how do we keep on flying? And the mechanics for that are very simple. It's basically like every day you use 1 fuel and 1 supply. That's how the units are broken down. But there are things that will adjust that for you also too. Yeah, and the goal would be, like, again, if you're looking at hacking, if you're looking at creating an adventure, if you're looking at doing stuff, like, you're going to look at creating a collection of anchors. Like an unseen is a form of anchor. We're all of a sudden going to tell people, in your anti-canon, we're going to nail some of this stuff down. We're going to anchor it at this point in the universe, and now all of a sudden these things are going to speak into the reality of what you're doing, and they might shift, but they're going to shift potentially only in relationship to another anchor that gets put down somewhere else, and how those things exist in tension with each other. Speaking of that, so like some of the other things, like the station itself is built of segments instead of districts. Our map looks a little bit different. So this is what the segment map looks like. Loops are very good for West March's type campaign, and Through the Void has a lot of potential for West March's stuff. One of my goals is maybe in December to run some West March's type stuff on the +1 server, where we can just run some different people through over the course of the month, kind of doing different adventures and seeing how those things impact each other as they go along. But instead of doing like the circle thing like we did for Down We Go, this one you'll have a set of concentric rings, and you can make these bigger or smaller depending on how you want your station to go, but essentially you'll start drawing line segments across these things, and you'll create the different parts of your station where different things are at as you go down. But there's a set of the different options for segments down here. Also, my expectation that segments are unique is pretty low. Like I think like in Down We Go, it made sense for like if you're only going to have one noble section of the city, but like you might have a couple of operation hubs, because power is decentralized in Eternus. You'll certainly have numerous docks, right? You're going to have probably different types of farms. And so the expectation is that you can roll these as you go. You can decide how you want them to be laid out in advance. But also when you leave and come back, you're going to erase some of them and you're going to roll again for new ones. So operations hubs, they don't specifically address what's being operated there, but it could be fastidious, miserly, overwhelmed, dilapidated. We'll see this as kind of a common thing for events, for hubs, for a lot of other stuff. Is here's what it is. Here's a little bit of language about it. Here are some questions you're going to ask the players, and here's a D6 or some other type of thing you're going to roll on to find out about what is happening in this segment of the station as you arrive. Right. So as you arrive at the dock, you'll ask the players, what's the name and look of the ship that just landed, what cargo is being unloaded, and what repairs are underway, regardless of what type of dock it is. But the name of that dock will give them some insight into how they're going to answer that question. And then you can also hire, and this is very riffed off of Down We Go. When I was doing it, I was like, I want to fill out a whole bunch of these. I'm just going to crib some of them straight from Down We Go. So if you're like, that sounds a lot like the docks and Down We Go, it is. Bots for sale, porters and deckers lining up looking for day work. Maybe they'll work for you. So you can spend 100 credits plus a share of the adventuring to hire one of these four different deckers or porters. So you've got Heigl Patchman, Meeple Scrub, Zakup D Rive, and Gozel Slab, that are all doing it. They've all got something going on with themselves also, but we also do have robots and drones, and so you can buy a Sally package drone, a bot that's good at picking things up and moving things around, that has grappler pod. It's noisy, it's kind of smoky, or you can do the LF2 Matic, that's much more expensive. It's Liftomatic is what it is what I did there. But it's a heavy kind of mover droid. But you do have to pay for batteries for these or power them in different ways from session to session. They can get hurt, have to be repaired, all that kind of stuff. But segments are written very much in a pretty straightforward fashion. You've got the farms. Again, farms, though, are more specific. Farms are either hydroponic, a flesh farm, an experimental farm, or a farm that's making breathable gases for things, right? And so when you show up, you're going to answer some questions about that. Then there's going to be a D6 table that tells you what are the things that could be happening here and why they might need your help. Why does any of this matter? Because you might need to go to the farms to interface with one of the factions or an NPC. You might just be trying to travel across the station and all of a sudden find yourself in a giant hydroponic farm that spans an entire segment that you have to go through and deal with the realities of what's there. And since you're drifters, they might try to co-opt you into doing work for them. But again, we've got 12 of these in the core version. There'll be 20 in the final version. D20s are kind of our goal for a lot of things. Factions. This format was kind of originally, like I said, determined by Aaron King. Is very much a hey, here's a little bit of text about them. The Legion, a military order from the Solar Wars that still grasp at the vestiges of its old power and seemingly noble ideals. Once made of a dozen or so member worlds, they now manage a single embassy and a small fleet. Their coffers are kept full from the Officers Academy, a training school that promises basic knowledge of ship discipline and maintenance in exchange for 4 years of service traveling the void. And so if somebody is an ex-Legion officer, it means they essentially, like, if you're playing with the Legion as a touchstone, if you're not playing with the Legion as an anchor, then the Legion is whatever you decide it is. If you are playing with the Legion as a faction, then all of a sudden this is going to tell you a little bit about what the Legion is. And so you can choose how you want to layer the different anchors to give more or less flexibility. And again, just rewrite it if you don't like it. But always there's going to be a little bit of like, hey, what are some of the duties and activities we'll regularly see from them? So they'll want to explore the void, patrol the shipyard, which connects to the pirates, because there's pirates always trying to steal ships, like pirates do. Spread Legion ideals. They might ask adventurers to join the Legion, fight for those in need, or spread Legion dogma. It's totally up to you whether their ideals are actually noble or not, or whether they're weird colonialist old fools that really should one day die and no longer exist, right? Like, that is up to each table to figure out how they want to take it, but that's the short way we've written it up. Being a member, an ex-Legion officer, doesn't mean you owe anything to the Legion other than your experience or expertise. In the same way that being a Verdant Mystic does not mean you belong to the Verdant Enclave. Being a bounty hunter does give you some kind of relationship with the bounty board, but we've written the bounty board in a way that just provides a lot of flexibility to bounty hunters, so it's not like an automatic, hey, this faction says it, you have to do it. Andromorph Collective, just because you're an Andromorph does not mean you have to be a part of the collective. But the rest of them, the no-brainers, which are a species of sentient gut bacteria, the IAB, don't have specific backgrounds currently, and I don't necessarily anticipate that there will be a one-to-one on those. What we did decide in this one, though, was that in addition to anytime we write a faction, we are going to write an NPC. So every single NPC, every single faction has one NPC, and that was really to make it really easy for the GM to basically say, hey, I need someone from this faction for people to talk to. who do I have? So a couple of them, like the Duchess Mutatus, does not. Comet Boy is not connected to a legion, or sorry, to a faction. But Legion Ensign Gardo Bunsen is a recent Academy graduate, right? He's fresh out of the Officers Academy and assigned to the courier ship Esperanca. A true believer in the Legion is the best hope for restoration of the culture's loss of the fall. Their optimism burns bright in the cold of space, but will it endure? And the idea would be that as you encounter Legion Ensign Gardo Bunsen, like the first time you encounter them, they might be an ensign, but if you encounter them multiple times, they might get promoted up. They would grow, they would change. But he has a couple of things he offers anytime he shows up, and that's essentially that he wants you to do something for the Legion, but he also wants to impress those above him, and he also knows a simple way to make your ship run more efficiently. Emmy Vert also designed the NPC system for Down We Go. It's often, we just call it the low key system. So it's what is their look, what do they offer, what do they want, and what do they know is what we're gonna determine, in addition to just kind of a little bit of information at the top. But we did make an intentional choice this time, like I said, to kind of make sure that there was an NPC for every faction, just to make it a little bit easier on the lift for the GM, so you don't have to like all of a sudden when they're like, who gave us this job? You're like, this person. Like, no, who's our contact? That you didn't have to just make up a dumb name. I made up dumb names for you in advance. And then events was the other piece. Like I said, just like with Unseens, we'll have different types of events based on location. So there will be station events, there will be void events, and then there will be planet. I don't know if we'll call them planet events, but basically planet-based events that'll happen, and there'll be a list of each one. So mouse droid races, a virtual assistant face-off, or hold hustle are all things that can happen on the station. So you might come across people betting on custom mouse droids that they have built and are racing. You might come across in the parking lot of a CGI Fridays a set of virtual assistants fighting each other because people have they have secrets about the people who work in their office. You might come across the station-wide sensation hold hustle, which is Storage Wars riff. And so if you're not familiar with Storage Wars, that's where they open up storage containers, people bid on them, and then they go pawn the stuff off to see how much it's worth. So you might get sucked into an episode of Hold Hustle and be able to bid against one of the different people who are well known on the show. I'm not a storage. I mean, I like Storage Wars. I will watch Storage Wars for 3 hours. I don't keep up with Storage Wars. I don't know anybody does. Every single one of these names is a riff on somebody from Storage Wars in real life. So if you're a big Storage Wars fan, this is a great product tie-in for you. And so, but the void events are all things that happen in space, right? So you come across a star that burns cold instead of bright. You hit a subspace inversion bubble. You come across this giant moth migration as they kind of float across a solar system. Huge with Storage Wars fan is the copy on the game. So again, we're gonna see, like, though each thing has a different function and has a differentiated like layout, events, segments, and a few other elements are built with this kind of same, hey, here's a little bit of text, here's some questions, and here's a roll you're going to make, right? You'll notice the math is different on different rolls to decide how exactly it want. Like on the subspace inversion bubble, I want like the large likelihood to be this 2 to 5 range, right? So I want it to be very likely that this is going to be the result they're going to get. I want it to be very unlikely that things are just horrible for them. And I want it to be very unlikely that things are going to be really great for them. But I also, even within this, like the subspace inversion bubble is, you could do a deck of cards to pick. The D6 tends to work pretty well also too. Any kind of spread that you want to do is pretty easy. It's a good question. So like one is scanners don't work, engines won't start, long range and shipboard comms are dead. Hovering out the port side window, a slow moving pirate skiff floats menacingly towards the ship, right? Basically that a pirate has been staking out this inversion bubble. On a 2 to 5 roll, roll, it says 2d4, so you're gonna pick 2 of these, right? Scanners don't work, engines won't start, comms are dead, pirate skiff looms nearby. So 2 of the bad things will happen. On a 6, engines and scanners are dead, but through the window, the crew sees the long lost Helion. What's the Helion? I don't know. They just see it out the window. That's for the GM to figure out what it is. But it's an excellent time to throw out, hey, here's a ship that is the Drift, and we're going to go explore the long lost Helion. And now, and that's going to be the adventure that we're on. Maybe there's a solution to getting out of this bubble over there, right? Maybe we're going to upgrade ships at this point in time. Like we don't necessarily know what's going to happen when they're on board the Helion, but that is what matters. But the players are going to tell us what's generating this rare subspace phenomenon. What bizarre sensor input does it create? How does your crew creatively stretch supplies while working on the solution? So like you're immediately going to get them started thinking about the most important things. GM's going to take that in. And again, you can go to a drift, but if you're traveling through the void, it might just be that you're writing a series of events that they're going to hit every so often during the course of the adventure, rather than a specific, hey, here's the drift you're going to. But it lets you start to see how the things kind of butt up against each other as far as like, hey, what is the Helion? Is it a ship? Okay, cool. I'm going to grab one of the ship drifts, and that's going to become what we're exploring this time around. So those are just some of the different elements. Dan asked about rumors work the same way as lore building. It's just a way to kind of prompt players into world building when you need one. And then adversaries are written in the same way that they are in the actual drifts itself. But that's some of the easier part, unless people have specific questions about those. I want to kind of leave some time for questions for other things like that. But as far as tone specifically goes, it is very broad. Like it really should be looked at as, what is the story arc we're telling right now? There are, like, if you watch most sci-fi properties, but let's specifically look at the Next Generation, because it was a very big transition in sci-fi becoming very popular on TV, right? As a not a Saturday morning thing or a late night thing, but in a primetime hour. The first seasons of Star Trek 1 and 2 are absolute camp. They're horrid. When people think of their favorite episodes, other than like them people loving Tasha Yar, there's not a lot in the first 2 seasons that people look back and are like, oh, I really loved that season, because there's just a lot of really bad stuff in there. The crew really starts to gel around season 3, and they get a lot better of a specific vision for what the universe looks like, and we start to see these kind of longer arcs start to pull across, even though it's still a very much an episodic show. And so if you're running something that it has kind of this more episodic campaign, the elements you're going to pick should match. The way you're going to set that out needs to be kind of included in a session 0, which we will have some kind of tools for that for GMs and for players to sit down and have that conversation. Because if you want totally off the wall gonzo, like Farscape type stuff, I love that. I want people to be able to do that, right? Like, and you should be able to pursue that within Through the Void. If you want something that's far more like ongoing, hey, we're fighting a big battle against these overwhelming other forces and races, then that's going to look a little bit different in how you're doing it. The core setting is post-racial, right? It's not post-scarcity, but it's a society that went up to being post-scarcity, fought wars over dumb stuff anyways, collapsed back down, and all of society now is kind of hanging on the edge at this station. And so people have gotten over petty squabbles by the need to collaborate, right? Which maybe is a little bit of a hopeless view for me. I don't care. It's what I like. But it also lets us go back out into the universe and not do a colonialism, right? It's all this space was discovered. All this space was inhabited. All of the inhabitants have now left these spaces because of their own poor choices, and have fled to this one space where they've had to get along for a while and are now coming back out to explore that thing. And so it lets us approach things as a rediscovering of where we have already been, rather than a, hey, we're discovering somebody else's stuff and rooting through it and treating it as if it was our own, which Down We Go does also too, but there's no established like there's no solar war event. It's like there's just ruins all over the place. Go explore them. But both of those leave the space to say what caused this, why is it here, who did it. Most of the time, like a lot of the drifts that are written, one of the lore building questions will be like, what corporation used to own this, right? Like the assumption being like megacorps were a big reality and had driven a lot of space expansion, but then maybe potentially are the reason that everything fell apart because capitalism sucks, right? So you're able to kind of talk a little bit more about what was this company about? Why were they horrible? Okay, cool. Let's steal their shit. Then you are specifically about species or races or other stuff like that. I don't know that I would approve for the core book a species-based enemy unless it was totally inhuman, non-conscious. Like we've got the von Neumanns, which are very much kind of like nanite conscious swarm of things, but they are so different. They're not presented as less, and they're just presented as ravenous. Like they are essentially kind of an incarnation of hunger, but they are so very different as to not be something that would make us immediately think, hey, here is a species that's a person. And you don't have to be enemies with them. Like there's no like they are hungry and therefore we hate them. There's like they're hungry. Is there a way to make that not the case anymore? Right? Is there a way to make these nanites satisfied? So aliens, like weird stuff, bizarre creatures, plants that have gained some level of sentience and are manipulating skeletons around a center, like as weird sinuous stuff. Absolutely. All that stuff, all that kind of weird stuff. But we mostly want a universe that like people can fly out to and marvel at and be amazed by, even as they look at how lethal it is and the fact that it might kill them. Which is one of, I would say, other than the mechanical differences and the narrative differences, if we wanted to ask the question, what is the big difference between Through the Void and Mothership, and what's the biggest tonal reality for me is I want people to say, oh man, we got to build really amazing stuff together. We got to describe things in a way that let us marvel at the construction of these. Like, I'll ask people just what their ship looks like from the outside, and we get the best descriptions. Very few people are like, it's a box. It's a box with pew-pews on the front and engines on the back, right? We get very wonderful, like kind of beautiful descriptions of like crappy ships all the time. And so it's great to go out and explore these things. And the question should always be, even as you've got this giant monster bearing down on you, like, what about it is terrifying? What about it is awe-inspiring? You know, make Barbarella for this sucker. Yeah, I'm a big Barbarella fan. So, yeah, I mean, so there's all of those options, and the chassis is so light. It's easy to just say, hey, for my adventure, we are going to slap another piece of tech on this, right? Like if you want the ships that people get on, like if they're going to salvage a ship to be a deck of cards Oracle system, and you're just going to lay it out in a pattern like Lucas was talking about, like which you could just riff from Dead Space because it's really easy to do. And we had a conversation about that on stream the other night. You could do that, right? Like you could be like, hey, I've got 52 things that could be on a ship. I've just laid them out, you know, and when people get to that section, that's what it is when you're 100%. Like it's easy to add that kind of stuff on for a specific adventure or module if you want to hack or build on top of. For the core stuff, we're going to kind of live we may introduce small little pieces of tech, but it'll largely be dice based. But for other things like that, I'll use little Oracle systems all the time for different pieces along those lines. So let's stop sharing. But yeah, this is, like I said, this is just kind of a big overview. This is a lot. This is kind of a brain dump of some of the different stuff that we're doing and we're looking at. I'm going to be doing another one in October. My hope in October is, like, if people want to come and share ideas and ask questions and say, hey, I've already been hacking on this, or here's what I'm looking at. It'll be a little bit more of a workshop one. If people had that stuff for today, that's great. I didn't anticipate it. I just wanted to kind of do, hey, here's a dump of some ideas and stuff we're going to look at, let people ask questions. So If you've got questions, if you're wondering about things, let me know. Now's a great time to ask. You can either turn on your microphone or just, type it in, preferably in the chat here, but also, I mean, if you send it on Discord or whatever, I'll find it eventually. Excellent. You're all perfectly sated and satisfied. Keegan, how about you? How's everything?
Things are good here. I don't have anything to share right now.
That's excellent. Excellent. Good to hear. Good to hear. No, like I said, my hope is in October, and I don't think I've popped up the date for that one yet, though I have written it on a calendar somewhere. But yeah, and again, like, I guess the one thing I do want to touch on that always seems to be a confusion for people. So adventures, right? We always talk, like, people will be like, well, and it's something we'll say, like, do you want to ride an adventure? People assume an adventure needs to look a certain way. Our assumption is that adventures specifically are going to use some of the elements of the normal design process. But it's really more about it being a collection of certain things. So an adventure doesn't necessarily, thank you, Keegan. 10:15 is the next Void Crafters workshop. Adventures don't necessarily have to be like, here's the faction that's hiring you to go to a drift for this reason, and here are the 2 events you're going to have on the way, right? That could be an adventure. Like, it's very possible, right? But it might be like, hey, we've got 2 factions here. They both want this thing. Here are different ways your characters may have found out about this thing. And here's some narrative things that are going to happen in a certain way along the way. So it could just be more like bulleted text, no D6s, no randomization. You're going to encounter all these things between point A or point B, or when you do certain things. And your drift might not have 3 variants, because usually a drift has 3 variants. It might be like, when you show up, it is this type of thing. We are not using the standard format because we want a little bit of extra to give you. That's fine. The assumption is that adventures collect a certain number of anchors, put them together with other elements that are not explicitly laid out in the SRD, and say, here is the thing you're going to be. But it's not expected that it's going to be like, here's the faction, here's the thing, here's the 2 points in between. Because the reality is the toolbox writing style of Through the Void and Down We Go and Together We Go systems is benefited by, when you're writing an adventure, a little bit more narrative text. And there's no specific way that we say write that text, other than understanding, like, it's a minimalist writing style. Less is more. Like, you want to give people just enough to know what they can do with it, but you don't want to give them any more than that. You want to point things towards the table, and say, hey, how do they make this their own? One of the best quotes, and it's on the back of the book right now, it'll probably be on the back of the book in the end, is by Ray from Story Queen Game. It says, Razor Edge game design, I love how quickly and easily it was to make a character, and the creative freedom that comes from interpreting those choices. The universe felt unique, expansive, and truly ours. And it was a really fun session with Ray, Alexi from over at Cloven Pine Games, Alex, and a couple other folks. It was just getting together and going and exploring something, but they ended up with, like, super soldier, like, very Space Marine-y Marines. It was Ray's character that had been experimented on horribly and had both, like, these horrible flashbacks of the past, but also could see echoes of the future. So they, like, Ray had taken Verdant Mystic, but was a merc. The way that they answered all the questions led to, like, a zombified, like had died and come back version of one of the other comrades that Ray's character had fought alongside in the Solar Wars, like, was on the state, like, this horrible ship, hoping they would come back, like, come down further in. They never did. They didn't. They ran away and survived. But all that came from them answering the questions. So, like, for me, the unwritten thing in the rules of the game right now, which certainly we need some we need some more development around is like writing good questions for the players and the GMs, and helping GMs know how to, or void keepers as we call them because we needed a cool word for it, knowing when and how to ask that question is great, because you don't want to always ask questions, right? You don't want to just not run a game, or run a game by just saying, I don't know, you tell me, because that's not what the keeper does. But the keeper needs to know when it is ideal to be asking those questions, and when you're establishing something for the first time, that's a good time to do it, remembering like setting up those lines and veils, knowing you can X card things, but also respecting the other players' like authorial voices in that moment. By the time I give somebody a copy of Through the Void, I don't want them to be thinking about like, what did Tony want for this adventure? I want them to be thinking, what does it look like to make this adventure our own? And so that's really what, for me, I think is one of the elements we'll still want to do a little bit more dev on. So Keegan asked us at the very beginning, we don't have a what is an RPG section. We won't have a what is an RPG section. We do have a what is the loop of this game, right? Like that is a big part of what we want people, like what are the things you're going to do as players and as characters in this game. Laying that out specifically and explicitly was a big part of the Ashcan's work. The final version of the game will have 10 to 12 essays in the back of the book that are basically one-page explanations of how to do something, right? It might be how to do faction conflict well. It might be telegraphing things. It might just be the basic procedure of play. And it's really funny because I'm somebody who was like blog post should be blog post, let your book be your book. But one of the critiques that games like Through the Void and other games oftentimes get is that we expect people to know how to do these things and we never tell them. And so you're just dependent on absorbing the RPG culture. In a lot of ways, I don't mind that. I want people to actually be dependent on absorbing the culture of RPGs. Because I think games are meant to be played. Or games come about when you play might actually even be a better way to state that. The game is really kind of the residue of what happens when somebody sits down with the text somebody has written or the rules someone's created and some friends. Like what happens when they are done was a game. But it's really like, it's a really fair critique to say OSR and even story games don't do a good job at explaining how do you do that thing. You're like, okay, cool. You said that. How do you do that? And I actually think worked examples are actually kind of a poor choice a lot of the time, because worked examples are designed to write down what something is kind of like, but that still doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. And so what we want to do is curate some articles that are a little bit more about what are good tools and techniques to have that would be good for any role-playing game, but specifically impact how we play Through the Void. And then we're going to put them at the back. They're going to be an appendix in. It's going to be like hey, if you need more help with this type thing. But I think it's a valid critique, which is why we're doing it. And yeah, largely, like, some people have been like, I already have this thing written. Is it okay if it's already written? And the answer is yeah. So you'll see some really great names from OSR and other tabletop spaces writing some of the different pieces that go into that segment. But like, I think even for zines or hacks or little like that type of one-page reflection at the end of how you want people to approach your work, or what is the tool they need to be able to do it well, is actually really helpful to write in kind of a deconstructed, learn this technique kind of way. Because a lot of the times that's what's keeping people from being able to lean into a game. And I think there's a lot of games that would benefit from that. So those are a couple of things we also have planned that are going to be going into Through the Void. I'm trying to keep the page count creep from getting up too high. But the final version will also it'll be hardback B5, about 120 pages probably. This is B5, and I think most of the people on the call have seen this, but like, this is B5. This is like an A5, right? So a B5 is between an A5 and an A4. It splits the difference between them. But the biggest thing it did was just give us more space for like to make the fonts way more readable. We didn't get a whole lot more out of it, but I just find it to be a really satisfying size of book to pick up. The hardbacks, it's not patchwork sized yet. The hardbacks are or these ones are in the +1 store tomorrow or Tuesday. The Ashcan Memory Hunters by Ray Nanjati and Death Grind Megastructure by Josh Hiddey will all be together in a bundle, and along with The Factory, which is with art by Thomas Novosel and Stella Cordry, wrote a little pamphlet adventure for Through the Void. And so we've got another pamphlet adventure with that Lucas wrote the text for that Lucas, now that we've done this workshop, I want to kind of come back to and look at a little bit more and talk about how we kind of add in some of those different elements that we just talked about and get it kind of formatted quite right. There's just been enough with the business changeover over the last little bit that I haven't got a chance to sit down and do any sort of dev edit on that, but it's a really great adventure pamphlet that we'll have come out also too from this. And so the goal is to keep stuff coming out even up until the launch. So we'll see some pamphlets, we'll see some adventures. If you write something for Through the Void and it's a pamphlet size or a couple of pages, and you're interested in having it published, talk to us. If it's bigger than that and you want to have it published, talk to us. We and also don't think about pamphlets as just trifold. Like, go to uprinting.com and look at all the different types of pamphlets that you can print. For Down We Go, we have 5 different expanded pieces of like pamphlet content. But one of them is a postcard. One of them is gatefold, which makes it more like a little mini GM screen. One of them, Keegan's, the Beneath the Necropolis, is actually going to end up being roll fold, which means that it will not just be a 3-fold pamphlet. It'll have like 2 additional panels that are folded inside a pamphlet, so it'll continue to roll out so that we can give each level. It is the first time you've heard this because we just finalized it this week. So like, think about weird pamphlet sizes also too, because it's pretty easy to print a pamphlet even in a weird size, and if you can do something cool with the form factor. But the big reason like that, the Bog, which is ended up being that GM screen size, was because there's this really cool piece of art by Carl Skullfungus, that it's not his actual last name. Carl's his first name. Skullfungus is his artist name. That just we wanted to bring to the forefront and make like a really kind of like player facing cool thing. It's like, hey, we could hide this information, but also like, here's the dungeon, look at it, and the GM can just run it from the back. And so there's like, if you want to do something cool with your design, do something cool with your design. Fold stuff up. Trifolds Jam Part 2, TTV edition. Cool. With that said, I don't think I got anything else off the cranium. And so again, 10/15 maybe, because this one got moved up a week also too, because I'm gonna go see La Dispute next Sunday. We've got another one coming up. So if you're watching this, come with ideas, and the next one, like, the goal really is, it's way more helpful, and it's like, hey, here's an idea I have for a thing. And part of me, even today, had I not taken the nap, we probably would have popped up and done like, let's just create 3 or 4 things together, right? Like, and walk through it. So for the next one, even if people don't come with them, I'll have 2 or 3 things I'm in process on that we'll sit down and actually just like knock down and look at, hey, what's it like to actually design these things, work as a team to do it. But I'd much rather do that with something that y'all bring, rather than something that I'm like, here's what's going to go in the book, and let me just mine y'all for cool ideas so that I get out of my head for a minute. I'm happy to do either one. I'd much rather be investing in y'all. So with that said, if you're watching this later, kudos. Good